The following video is from our first annual charity Freedom Walk, held at the New Hampshire Capitol Plaza in Concord, New Hampshire on September 14, 2024. This event is sponsored by the New Hampshire Patriot Hub, nhpatriothub.org, a website bringing New Hampshire together to educate, inspire, and call everyone to action to preserve and uphold our God-given rights and freedoms. Check it out today and add your event to our calendar page. We decided to organize this walk because the New Hampshire Patriot Hub has been sponsoring tours of the Monument to the Forefathers in Plymouth, Massachusetts, every May and October for the past 2.5 years. Our next tour is on October 12th. You can register at the link shown. We took notice that many people do not know about this monument, and we are looking to change that with this walk. We are walking to, first, raise money for The Jenny, a non-profit company in Plymouth, Massachusetts, who give tours of the monument and the town of Plymouth to educate all of us on the true history of the founding of our great country. Secondly, we are walking to raise awareness of the monument to the forefathers. And third, we are walking to pay tribute to our forefathers who gave us a free nation and walked from one battle to the next, never looking back. The monument to the forefathers consists of 5 statues. Faith, the largest monument in the center, followed by morality, law, education, and finally, liberty at the base of the monument. The monument was built to honor the Pilgrims for their bravery in leaving everyone and everything they had behind to come to the New World in the hope of being able to create a civil government based on Christian Judeo principles, where everyone would live in freedom, knowing their rights come from God and not man. Knowing this truth is how we become self-governing members of society where everyone is treated equally. Everyone enjoys the same freedoms and rights, and everyone embraces the fact that each one of us is uniquely made. This monument is the framework or matrix for liberty. If one of these 5 principles fails, liberty turns into tyranny because it means man has taken over a country and pushed God aside. It is what we are living with in America now. Morality is down, law and order are non-existent, it's being abused, and education of our children is now in the hands of the government instead of parents. We need to teach everyone about the monument to the forefathers so we can all understand why, how, and what makes America the freest nation in the world. Once we understand this, together, we can rebuild the framework of America, bring God back into our families, schools, communities, and our government. Once again, we will be a self-governing people who will never take our liberties for granted again. From all of us here at the New Hampshire Patriot Team, we thank you for your support. God bless New Hampshire, and God bless America.
If I can have everybody's attention, please. Michelle Gallagher, the author of this beautiful book, the guidebook, Forefathers Monument Guidebook, there we go, is going to come and explain this beautiful monument to us. So, Michelle?
We walked up here and we saw everybody in the patriotic outfits and the flags, and my husband Dan, I looked at him and I was like, those are our people. Those are our people. So I am so grateful. Yeah, you guys, I mean, I was talking with Tom and we had a great time last night with Deb and Dan. We had a lovely dinner. We were just talking, you know, it's so easy to just talk about what's going wrong and to feel frustrated, but I have such admiration for Deb and New Hampshire Patriot Hub, just doing something, right? Just getting out and just showing up. And so I applaud all of you. We appreciate the opportunity to come here. The question has to be asked, okay, we're in Concord, New Hampshire. Why are we talking about a monument in Plymouth, right? Who has thought that? Like, why are, okay, thank you for the honesty. The reason why, because Deb has come down to Plymouth and she has experienced this monument. It's called the Forefathers Monument. And as I was talking with them last night, we discovered this. We live in Plymouth, my husband Dan and I. We discovered this monument for ourselves when we moved downtown, because the monument is, I want to say, just a couple blocks from the waterfront, right? Everybody comes to Plymouth, they want to go to the Mayflower, they want to go to Pilgrim Rock, and that's all great, but they often come to town to see where the Pilgrims began, and they leave and they don't even know this monument is here. And before you leave today, if you come to our table, we have a little miniature replica, so you can kind of see a tiny, tiny version of what is an 81-foot tall monument. And so we moved to downtown Plymouth, and we start walking the dog in the neighborhood, and we come up around the corner on Allerton. I mean, totally residential. You would not think anything was there. And we come up around the corner, and we see like 81 foot tall, like the tip of faith pointing up, this massive monument. We're like, what in the world is this thing? Why is it here in the middle of a residential neighborhood? And what we found out later was that it was built there when it was one of the tallest hills in Plymouth, overlooking Plymouth Harbor, right? So over time, all of the residentials built up. So it's kind of like this hidden gem, but I often say that it's kind of our Statue of Liberty. And it's I often say it's probably the most important monument across our nation, because when you go up there and you look at all of the figures, there's 5 main figures, and then on the lower part, which you'll see at the table, the seated figures below, because there's faith, and then there's morality and law and education and liberty. Each of those lower figures has other lower figures below. They've got these huge marble panels that kind of show the embarkation and all of the different key moments of the Pilgrim story. So you can literally walk up to this monument and you can see the entire beginnings of America told through the Pilgrim story. They erected this monument. It was completed in 1889, and as you walk up, it says, erected for, I'm getting ahead of myself, I always forget, erected by a grateful people in remembrance of their labors, sacrifices, and sufferings for the cause of civil and religious liberty. So you walk up and you see this majestic monument, and it's a tribute to the Pilgrim legacy and how they created self-government and brought self-government to America. And I don't know if you guys are like me. We discovered this monument, and I just felt like something so beautiful and so significant and so majestic should have a really cool guidebook to it. People come to Plymouth and they have no idea it's here, but it tells the story of America. And so as I was telling Deb last night, in 2019, I left my job. We went down to one income. We kind of took a step of faith, just like you guys are coming out here and doing something. We decided we wanted to do something. And so I took a couple years to put together this guidebook. And what I do is I take a visual tour of the monument. It's filled with beautiful photography, but what I do is I go through all of these symbolic figures of the monument, and I tell the Pilgrim story, so that somebody who comes to Plymouth who maybe doesn't know anything about our origins, through the visual telling of this monument, you can experience the Pilgrim story. And so that's how the book came to pass. When I started the book, I think I was like most people, like, you think Pilgrims, you think like belt buckles, turkey, Thanksgiving, right? I had, I don't even remember what I learned in school, but I had no idea how incredible the Pilgrim story was. We've lost a lot of that history. You guys are familiar with that, as time goes on, right? Whether it's through omission or revision, we've lost a lot of the true Pilgrim story. And so that's what I wanted to do in the book. And especially for me as a Christian, it was really inspiring, because I always describe the Pilgrims as kind of like, they're almost like the original Bible-believing church. They were a group of Christian believers in the state-run Church of England who did not want to worship according to what the state was telling them. The Church of England had a lot of unbiblical practices in the church. They're reading their Bibles going, hey, we don't see this in the Bible as according to our conscience, we don't want to do this. So a lot of the pageantry, a lot of the man-made human inventions of what was then the state-run Anglican church, they didn't want to worship according to that. They were conscientious objectors, if you will. But at that point in time, you couldn't not be part of the state church. For you to not attend church and to just go off and worship on your own was illegal. You were considered a treason. You were considered, a threat to the state. So you've got a group of Bible-believing Christians, basically, who just decided we're going to worship God according to the Bible. We're not going to worship according to all of these rules that man has made up, and they've kind of perverted the Word of God. So they go and they start worshiping on their own, literally risking their lives. You know, they're getting ratted out by their friends and families. Many of them went to jail. Some of them were martyred. The Pilgrims were known as separatists. So within the church, you had separatists and Puritans. Which we always hear about the Puritans and the Pilgrims, right? So the Puritans were part of the church. They thought that they could still reform it. The separatists were like, nope, too far gone. We're out of here. We're going to go do our own thing. So literally, the Pilgrims were like the rebels of their day, right? And I became so inspired by what they risked, because they literally, as a small church, probably like a group like this, they risked their lives, leaving England, fleeing the persecution, spending time in Holland. They tried to build a new life in Holland. That lasted for about 10, 12 years before literally their congregation is aging. They're kind of dying out. Holland was very secular. Try to imagine raising kids in New York City. They're kind of losing the influence of their children, and they're looking at a group this size thinking, man, if we don't do something, we're going to lose the future of our children, and if we're going to make a move, we've got to make a move now. And so they prayerfully decided that they were going to go to America, and just what they endured on the Mayflower alone, just making the journey, it's absolutely harrowing to look at what they went through. You know, a lot of us, I always say, you know, a lot of us have a hard time getting motivated sometimes just to get up and go to church on days when we're tired. And what they went through so that they could worship God according to the Bible, so that they could ensure that their children had an environment where they could worship God and live in freedom, is absolutely inspiring. So I learned so much just myself in researching the book, and I hope it's an inspiration to everybody who reads it. And I just want to read a quick excerpt. From the filthy jails of London to the sweat-filled factories in Leiden to the bitterly cold shores of Cape Cod, at each pivotal moment of the Pilgrim story, these extraordinary men and women were determined to live and even die, if the Lord allowed it, according to the convictions of their faith. The Pilgrims were convinced God had led them to plant a new settlement at Plymouth Colony. With unshakable faith, they believed that from these humble beginnings, that one small candle could light 1,000, and that the light of the gospel could reach an entire nation. And of the Mayflower's 102 passengers, there were only 102 passengers on the ship. Only 51 people survived the first winter at Plymouth. Dozens of children were orphaned, and entire families were lost. And I'll pause and say that in the book, I've got an illustration that shows everybody who came on the boat, and then you flip the page, and the silhouettes that are grayed out shows who did not survive. And you can see entire families are grayed out. You can see one child survived, and all of the other. It's striking when you think of, for that small of a group, imagine this type of a group, and half of you don't survive. I mean, imagine what that must have been like. Yet in the spring of 1621, when the Mayflower sailed out of Plymouth Harbor to begin her return voyage back to England, not a single pilgrim was on board. Despite the astonishing offer of free passage from Captain Jones to anyone in the settlement who wanted to leave, all of them, every survivor, men and women alike, had opted to remain at their new home, Plymouth Colony. Whatever awaited them in the future, they had chosen to face it in America. And that's really remarkable, because they scraped and saved even to just make the expensive journey. And you can imagine going through all of that, and then Captain Jones says, you know what, it's been a rough winter. Anybody who wants to bail, anybody who wants to get out of here, free passage. And not one single person. That was so inspiring to me. And the reason why I think the Forefathers Monument is probably the most important monument in our nation is because it shows the biblical foundation for America. Incredible, incredible. It was dedicated in 1889. I said that we just celebrate its 135th anniversary. And its 5 main figures, I just want to do a quick overview. You can go over to the table and you can see that Faith is the largest one, and she's pointing up to God in heaven. And then the 4 lower figures that are seated around her. We often call it the matrix of liberty, because each principle builds on the next. The way the designer designed it to be interpreted as it's from faith that we receive our faith in God is through Christ in God in heaven, and then faith comes down to morality. Faith becomes the foundation for our morality, the 10 Commandments. Our morality then becomes the foundation for our laws. And then our laws are perpetuated down through the generations through education. And then that becomes the foundation for liberty. And they call it the matrix of liberty because each of these foundational principles, if even one falls down, liberty falls down. And that's what we see in our society right now, right? As we become a more secular society, well then everyone does what's right in their own eyes. Then morality falls down. If morality is defined outside of the Bible, morality falls down. And then our laws are not just. And then our education, we see what's happening with our education. So you can see why it's a fascinating combination. And all of those figures represent the historic Pilgrim legacy. Those are the planks, the foundations, if you will, of how they were able to create self-government. So let's go through them quickly. So faith, the Pilgrims were separatists, I mentioned that. They left the church to worship God on their own. Governor William Bradford wrote, this is one of my favorite quotes of him, he said, "If no place upon the face of the earth should be free for us, we have a most assured hope that heaven itself is open for us by Christ, who is the way." You know, they came to the New World, they sailed here on the Mayflower in search of religious freedom and to bring the gospel to the New World. And that pursuit of religious freedom would become a foundational freedom in America. Founding Father James Madison, I love this quote. He said, James Madison said, "We have staked the whole future of American civilization, not upon the power of government, far from it. We have staked the future of all of our political institutions on the capacity of mankind for self-government, upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves, to control ourselves, to sustain ourselves according to the 10 Commandments of God." And the second figure is morality. So from faith in God through Christ, we receive morality, the 10 Commandments. And the Pilgrims lived according to God's biblical laws. They lived according to the 10 Commandments. We often call them, America's first church plant. They came, as I said, to worship God freely. They wanted to spread the gospel. And this foundation of biblical morality formed the basis for what is America's Judeo-Christian roots. It's funny, today we're gathered in Concord, and I was teasing Deb, it's the live free or die state, but I was chuckling, the constitutions that you have over on the table. New Hampshire was the 9th state admitted to the Union, and your 1784 Constitution talks about the right of conscience. It encourages morality and public piety or reverence for God. And I love this. I highlighted it. Part 1, Article 6, you start flipping it open. We forget what our founding documents speak to. But it says Part 1, Article 6 states, "As morality and piety rightly grounded on evangelical principles will give the best and greatest security to government and will lay in the hearts of men the strongest obligations to due subjection. And as the knowledge of these, morality and piety, is most likely to be propagated through a society by the institution of what? The public worship of the deity. The people of this state have a right to empower the legislature to make provision for the support of public Protestant teachers of piety, religion, and morality." Is that not incredible? I mean, that's your founding constitution, right? And it's fascinating because it shows the historic public support for morality in civic government, morality in public life. I think oftentimes, we hear that inaccurate kind of misnomer of separation of God and state, which is nowhere in our Constitution, it's nowhere in our Bill of Rights or founding documents. That was a private letter from Thomas Jefferson to someone in the church speaking about not that we could not express ourselves in our faith in the civic arena, but that the state would never encroach upon our rights in the church. So it's been twisted. So I loved that. And in carrying that on, just a few years later, John Adams wrote, "What? We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion." We have no power. Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate for the government of any other. And that's why when you remove morality, when you remove faith from the American experiment, that's why it starts to fall down. The next statue is law. And the Pilgrims understood that the government was established by God to restrain evil and to advance good. That is the purpose of government. They modeled the Mayflower Compact after their own church covenant. They swore a church covenant as a congregation where they entered into a solemn agreement with one another as part of the church and God. And so the Mayflower Compact was modeled after that. Keep in mind that on the Mayflower, probably about half the Mayflower were Pilgrims, what we think of as part of the Scrooby Church in England, and the other part was people who were really just signing on for the ship because they couldn't fill the whole ship with their own congregation. They couldn't afford to. So at the last minute, and I go into greater detail in the book, but in the last minute, outside people started coming in. So they often call them the saints or the pilgrims and the strangers. So imagine you're all a church congregation and you are in covenant with each other and you pray together and you're intimate. And then these guys over here, they just came in because they want to go to the New World. So these guys jump in. So it's a difference of relationship, right? So you're supposed to go to Virginia. You veer off course. And I tell the whole story of divine intervention in the book. And so they find themselves in Plymouth Harbor. The Pilgrims, the church, believes that God has led them there. And they want to get off the boat and start their life there. The strangers over here are like, that's not what we signed up for. And once we get off the ship, you can't tell me what to do. And they were right. So they had to come up with some form, some compact to say that, okay, we're all in this together. We need a civil construct. And so that Mayflower Compact was the first instance of self-government in America. It's quite remarkable. I always joke that, it's hard to organize something like this or a yard sale or a neighborhood block party, and try to imagine getting a whole bunch of people together that they could create that kind of consensus was really remarkable. But they modeled it after their own church covenant. The other people outside of the church that were on board the ship, all they knew was the monarchy. All they knew was the king told us what to do. But the Pilgrims, they were self-governing as a church. So they already had experience in how do we govern amongst ourselves. They voted on their leaders. They voted on their pastor. So they were the ones with the experience in self-government because they did it as a church. Law is also another legacy of the Pilgrims because they created the 1636 Pilgrim Code of Law, and this is remarkable. It's the first instance of legal code in America. They came up with a Bill of Rights for its citizens, due process, and trial by jury. That all originated with the Pilgrims at Plymouth Colony. It's remarkable that when they arrived in that land and they made peace eventually with the natives, there were some initial skirmishes, but they were able through, Squanto and others, they were able to communicate with the natives. That was one of the remarkable divine interventions. We always say, of all the gin joints, of all the places you could have landed on the eastern coast, that these pilgrims managed to land on the one place where there just happened to be a native who spoke English. It's remarkable. It reminded me of the eagle that was circling. It's like God knew exactly where they were going to be, and he provided exactly what they needed. But they were able to strike up a peace treaty, the Pilgrim-Wampanoag Peace Treaty, and it lasted for over 50 years. That's amazing. William Bradford was probably around 20 years old when he arrived at Plymouth Colony. So 50 years later, it lasted through his lifetime. That's incredible. The Pilgrims also created the first registry of deeds in America, which is remarkable. And they did it to handle land transactions to protect the natives from exploitation. You don't hear that much, do you? Deeds had to be filed with the colony official, and the natives' land title was required to be fully recognized. And they did that because what was happening is subsequent people were coming and they were plying the natives with alcohol, getting them drunk, and then getting them to sign anything and do anything. So there were abuses going on. So they set that in motion to prevent that. And so the Pilgrims relied on biblical principles to write civil compacts, peace treaties, and to create laws that promoted justice and fairness. And the next figure is education. The first Geneva Bible came to America on board the Mayflower. And the Pilgrims relied on the Bible to educate their children. They used the Bible to teach them how to read. They used the history of the Bible, the poetry of the Bible, the virtues, the morality of the Bible to teach their children right and wrong. And literacy was important for the Pilgrims The most important reason literacy was important was because they wanted their children to be able to understand and read and understand Scripture for themselves. They wanted to be able to impart their faith, and they wanted them to be able to read the Bible for themselves. It wasn't just enough that it was the faith of their fathers. They needed it to be their faith as well for the generations, right? We can relate to that. They also wanted their children to be able to read and understand if government was proposing unbiblical laws. So it wasn't just literacy for the sake of a relationship with God and being able to read the Bible, but they needed them to be able to know if laws are being proposed, is that an unbiblical law? And if you can't read, if you're not literate, you can't understand that. So the importance of education is vital for us to maintain our freedoms. We see that happening in society right now with what's happening with education. And this is remarkable. Founding Father John Jay, first Chief Justice of the United States, wrote, "Every member of the state ought diligently to read and to study the Constitution of his country and teach the rising generation to be free. By knowing their rights, they will sooner perceive when they are violated and be better prepared to defend and assert them." That's why education is so important. And the last and final figure, which is often everyone's favorite figure because Liberty's so cool, he's holding the sword and he's got the broken chains and he looks, he looks great. Liberty is the final figure. When you look at the historic Pilgrim story, they brought 3 essential freedoms to America. They brought religious liberty, that was the reason why they came, but they also brought economic liberty. The first, and I go in the book, I go into it, they brought free market trade. The Pilgrims had probably the first and most dramatic exercise in socialism versus capitalism. And I tell the story of how they had to repay the debt and how they divvied up the land and how they all worked together, and it was a disaster. It failed utterly. So their attempt at socialism failed utterly, but the minute that they divided up the land and gave everyone a plot, and you guys work your own plot, and then you are able to enjoy the fruits of your own labor, guess what happened to productivity? Through the ceiling. And they never had any lack after that. And they also created constitutional liberty. Between the Mayflower Compact and the 1636 Code of Law, the Pilgrims believed that liberty came from what? God, not the state. That's what this whole thing has been about. The government was entrusted with certain limited powers, not to grant us liberty. We don't get our liberties from the government. The government is entrusted with limited power, not to give us our liberties, but to protect our liberties. And the founders knew this, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. What? That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, not to grant them, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from what? The consent of the governed. And so government is designed to serve us, not the other way around. And so through the figures of faith, morality, and law, and education and liberty, we see how the Pilgrims were able to create self-government and liberty and freedom in America through a biblical worldview. That's why this statue is so important. That's why I'm here in Concord, New Hampshire, from Plymouth, Massachusetts, talking about this, because it's such an important reminder of our foundations, which it's so easy in the world today to be convinced otherwise, but our foundations are biblical. And this is one of my all-time favorite quotes of Reagan, President Ronald Reagan. And you've likely heard it. "You and I have within ourselves the God-given right and the ability to determine our own destiny. But freedom is what? Never more than one generation away." Can we not attest to that right now? What we experienced growing up as children and what we see now, and then we imagine what our children will have? Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way that they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we do what we're doing today, if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-taught lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same. And so I want to commend you guys. I want to thank Deb and her whole team. I'm so impressed with you guys for coming out here and just educating, raising awareness. Don't be afraid to get involved. And probably 4 years ago, I would have been sitting over there with you guys, and God put something on my heart to do, and so we took a step of faith and we did it. So when I talked with Deb and she was like, "You know what, it's on my heart to do this, and I'm taking a step of faith," and I'm like, we're all in, we're there. So I applaud you guys, and I just want to say, God bless New Hampshire. God bless Massachusetts. God bless the New Hampshire Patriot hub, and we really appreciate what you guys are doing, and we support you. And I hope that you guys will, if you have time, I hope you'll come down to Plymouth and see us. Go to the Jenny. Leo and Nancy do amazing tours. I told you that October 12th that we would be out of town. It looks like that trip may not be off. So if it's off, we will see you guys on October 12th and welcome you in Plymouth. And I just want to thank you all. So come say hi to us at the table. We've got some free stuff we'd like to give away. And we really appreciate the opportunity to come and share with you. Yep.